I have photographed the founder's remembrance for the Harrogate Gazette for the better part of 11 years, and in all that time, I had never once seen the long silence broken. That is the first thing you must understand about that morning in the Court of Remembrance, before I tell you what I saw a young guardsman do, and why I have never been able to put it out of my mind. The long silence is not merely a pause in a program. It is the spine of the entire ceremony. 2 full minutes, no bell, no drum, nothing but the wind moving through the banners and the low sound of a kingdom holding its breath together. Nobody moves. Nobody so much as shifts their weight from one foot to the other. Not the king. Not the veterans standing in their rows with medals catching the gray morning light. And certainly not the guards. I was crouched near the third row of benches that day, camera low against my chest, waiting for the wreath laying so I could get the frame the Gazette always wanted. King Alaric bent at the sanctum wall, white gloves against gray stone, the names of the fallen behind him. I had my angle picked out before the trumpets even sounded. What I had not picked out, what no one could have picked out, was the old man 3 benches to my left, a man I would come to know as Corporal Silas Merritt, retired these many years from the king's own fusiliers, beginning, very slowly and very quietly, to go down. He did not cry out. That was the thing that struck me even before I understood what was happening, how silent it was, how private, as if some part of him was still trying to keep his failing a secret from the entire assembled court of remembrance. He had come to his feet with the rest of his row when the herald called the fusiliers' names, using the black cane he always carried, and for the first 30 seconds of that silence he stood as straight as any man there, chin lifted, metal ribbons pinned in a neat row above his heart, eyes fixed on the sanctum wall where, I would later learn, one particular name was carved among the hundreds. Then something in his right leg, the leg that had carried a fragment of shrapnel behind the kneecap for over half a century, since a ridge in the north whose name meant nothing to most of the people gathered there that morning, simply stopped answering him. I watched his knee dip, just an inch, maybe less. He caught himself on the cane, jaw tight, and for a moment I thought that would be the end of it, a small private stumble that only a photographer with a long lens happened to notice. But the cane's rubber foot had found a seam between 2 cobblestones, and when he tried to shift his weight back onto it, it slid, and his knee dipped again, further this time, and I understood with a cold drop in my stomach that Silas Merritt was not going to catch himself. He was an old man in a crowded silence that no one was permitted to break, and he was going down, and the row of veterans on either side of him were themselves too frail, too slow, too bound by the same iron rule of stillness to reach him in time. I want to be honest about what I did in that moment, because it is not a flattering thing to admit. I raised my camera. Some reflex trained into me by 11 years of chasing the moment overrode whatever better instinct I might have had, and I began, God forgive me, to focus. I was perhaps 4 seconds from taking a photograph of an 81-year-old war veteran collapsing in front of his king, rather than doing a single thing to help him. And I have thought about that more than once in the years since, turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's crawling underneath. I never took that photograph because someone else moved first. He stood post at the northern edge of the sanctum steps, one of 6 ceremonial guardsmen positioned along the processional route, red tunic, black bearskin, white gloves, rifle held at the present. A young man whose name I did not yet know but whose stillness I had, without really thinking about it, photographed a dozen times over the years as a kind of visual anchor for the whole ceremony. He could not have been more than 4 or 5 paces from Silas Merritt's row. Close enough. Too close, in a way, because it meant he saw everything I saw, and unlike me, he was under direct, absolute, standing orders not to move a muscle, not to break formation, not to so much as let his eyes wander from the fixed point ahead of him, for the entire duration of the king's tribute. I would learn later exactly how serious that order was, that a guardsman who breaks the long silence without lawful cause can be relieved of ceremonial duty on the spot, can face a formal inquiry, can, in the harshest reading of the regulations, be judged to have disgraced the post he stands. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew, watching from behind my useless camera, was that the guardsman's eyes moved. Just his eyes first, a flick sideways, quick as a struck match, toward the old man swaying on his cane. And then, before I had even finished drawing my next breath, the rest of him moved too. He did not run. That is important, because running would have shattered the long silence like a dropped plate, would have turned 200 solemn faces toward the noise and the drama of it, would have been, in its own way, a kind of disrespect to the very silence he was breaking to preserve a man's dignity. Instead he stepped, one long, controlled, almost soundless stride out of his post, rifle coming down out of the present arms into the crook of his elbow in the same motion, white glove already reaching, and he caught Sela's Merritt under the arm and across the back a full half-second before the old man's knee finally buckled all the way through. I have watched that motion in my memory so many times that I sometimes wonder if I am remembering it correctly, or simply remembering the memory of it. But I know I am not wrong about the essential shape of it, because I have since heard it described the same way by no fewer than 6 other witnesses, and because the guardsman himself, when I finally sat across from him, weeks later with my notebook open, described the same half-second in almost the same words. He said it did not feel like a decision. He said it felt like watching a glass tip off the edge of a table and finding his hand already there. What he did next was the part that undid the whole crowd, I think, more than the catch itself. He did not simply prop Sela's Merritt back onto his feet and step away, technically returning to his post with the letter of his duty half satisfied. He stayed. He shifted his own stance, planting his boots wide and low the way I imagine they must teach for bearing a wounded man's weight, and he let the old veteran lean the whole of his weight into his shoulder and forearm, rifle now tucked flat and quiet against his own side. And there, not 5 paces from where King Alaric himself stood with his head bowed toward the sanctum wall, not 20 feet from where 200 silent witnesses stood in their own frozen tribute, the guardsman held an old soldier upright through the remainder of the long silence, saying nothing, moving nothing but what was necessary, his face schooled back into the same flat, disciplined calm it had worn a moment before, as though this too, this quiet act of mercy, were simply another form the ceremony had always been meant to take. I do not know how many people in that courtyard actually saw it happen. I have asked myself that question many times since. The rows were deep, the light was flat and gray, and the whole point of the long silence is that no one is looking anywhere but forward, toward the sanctum, toward their own private grief. But I saw it, because I was watching for exactly this kind of moment, professionally trained to watch for it, and I can tell you that the handful of people near enough to see, 3 veterans in Sela's Merritt's own row, a woman I later learned was his neighbor, 2 other guardsmen at their posts, and a sergeant major standing at the foot of the sanctum steps with a face like carved stone. Every one of them went very still in a different way than the stillness around them. The stillness of people who have just watched something happen that the rules did not account for. The old man's eyes were closed. I remember that clearly, because it was the detail that told me this was not embarrassment or wounded pride passing over his face but something closer to relief, a kind of surrender he had perhaps been fighting since the herald first called his row to its feet. His lips moved once, and though I could not hear the words from where I crouched, I would learn from the guardsman himself, much later, what they had been. "Thank you, son," just that. 2 words, spent like the last of something precious. And then Sela's Merritt held his silence with the rest of the court of remembrance, upright now not through his own strength, but through the strength of a stranger's arm, until the 2 minutes ran their full and terrible length, and the trumpet finally sounded to release them all. I did take a photograph in the end. Not of the fall, there was no fall to photograph, because it never happened, but of the moment just after the trumpet, when the guardsman eased Sela's merit down onto the stone bench at the row's end with a gentleness that looked strange coming from a man in full ceremonial dress, rifle and bearskin and all, and the old man reached up with a trembling hand and gripped the young man's wrist for just a moment before letting go. I did not know, when I pressed the shutter, that the photograph would run above the fold 2 days later, or that it would be the beginning of the trouble. I only knew that I had almost missed the truer picture entirely, chasing the king's wreath instead of the moment that was actually happening 4 benches away, and that some instinct older than 11 years of professional habit told me to keep my lens on the guardsman a moment longer, because whatever I had just watched was not finished yet. It was not finished, not nearly. The king completed the wreath-laying in the same measured, unhurried way he always did, laying the ring of white lilies and fusilier blue ribbon against the base of the sanctum wall, straightening, and standing a long moment with his head bowed before the assembled names of the dead. I have covered enough of these ceremonies to know the king well enough by sight if not by acquaintance, and I can tell you that whatever else might be said of Alaric of Eldermoor, he never once, in 11 years of my watching him do this, treated the sanctum wall as theater. He bowed to it the way a man bows to something that could, with very little difference in fortune, have been carved with his own name. I do not know, standing where I stood, whether he saw what had happened in the 3rd row. I would learn much later that he had. The chaplain gave the closing words. The band played the old anthem, the slow one, the one written not for marching but for mourning, and the ranks of veterans began, row by row, the long and careful work of sitting back down or being helped back down or, in the case of those in wheelchairs, simply exhaling the breath they had been holding through the whole ordeal of the tribute. I lowered my camera and let the noise of the courtyard come back to me, the shuffle of 200 pairs of shoes, low murmured conversation, somewhere a child's voice asking a question that was quickly hushed, and I looked for the guardsman, meaning to get his name for my notes if nothing else, and that was when I saw the sergeant major reach him first. I did not hear the whole exchange. I was still 40 feet off, working my way through the departing crowd with my camera bag banging against my hip, and by the time I came close enough to catch more than fragments, the worst of it seemed already to have passed between them. But I heard enough. I heard the sergeant major, a broad, gray-templed man named Corwin Blythe, as I would soon learn, whose voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has spent 30 years making sure that flatness is the only thing his voice ever carries on duty. Say the words, "You left your post," in a tone that made 2 nearby veterans turn their heads. I heard the guardsman, standing at a rigid attention that somehow looked more like penance than discipline, answer with nothing but, "Yes, Sergeant Major," offered twice, to 2 different accusations, without excuse and without argument. I did not yet know his name. I would learn it within the hour when I finally caught him alone near the guard barracks gate, his bearskin removed and tucked under one arm, his red tunic collar loosened just enough to show he had, for the moment, been stood down from further duty that day. Guardsman Tobias Wren, 26 years old. 3 years in the ceremonial ranks. 5 before that in the regular army, a young man with a plain, open, unremarkable face that gave you no hint at all of what he had just done in front of 200 witnesses and his own king. "I'm not looking for trouble," I told him, which was true, though I understood even as I said it that trouble was very likely already looking for him. "I just want to know if the old gentleman is all right." Wren looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and I remember thinking that whatever he was weighing behind that plain, tired face, it was not whether to trust a newspaper man. It was something else. "He's resting," he said finally. "His neighbor took him home. He'll be all right." And then, before I could ask the question I most wanted to ask, "Why did you do it?" knowing what it would cost you, he said something that I wrote down word for word in my notebook that evening, because I did not want to lose the shape of it. I was standing 4 feet from a man who fought so that I'd never have to. I wasn't going to let him fall on the ground while I watched. I did not print that quote for 2 more days. Not until I had gone back to Silas Merritt's small house on Coldwater Row and sat with him at his kitchen table and understood a little better what I had actually witnessed. But I want to set it down here, at the start of this account, because it is the truest thing anyone said to me in the whole business that followed, and because everything else I am going to tell you, the inquiry, the reprimand that nearly ended a young man's career before it had properly begun, the old man's own long and terrible reason for standing through pain he had no obligation to endure, and the morning, weeks later, when I stood once more in the court of remembrance and watched King Alaric himself settle the matter in front of the whole assembled guard. All of it grew out of that half-second decision a guardsman made without, by his own account, ever quite deciding to make it. I should say something here about who I am, since I am the one telling this, and a story is only as trustworthy as its teller. My name is Edmund Voss. I am 53 years old, and I have spent the better part of 30 of those years behind a camera for the Gazette, first as a boy running film for the sports desk, and then, once my eye proved steadier than my ambition for anything else, as the paper's man for ceremony and occasion, coronations, state funerals, the annual parade of colors, and every year without fail, the Founders' Remembrance in the Court of Remembrance at the Palace at Harrogate. My own father served in the Fusiliers a generation before Silas Merritt's war, though a quieter war than his, and came home to raise me on stories he almost never told, and a silence he kept every single Founders' Day of his life until the year he died. I mention this only because it will explain, I think, why I could not simply write my dispatch and move on to the next assignment once the Court of Remembrance had emptied that morning. I had grown up watching a man carry an old wound the way Silas Merritt carried his, in silence, on his own 2 feet, refusing every offer of a chair. I wanted to understand why a man would do that. And I wanted to understand, just as much, why a young guardsman with everything to lose had looked at that same old stubbornness and decided, in half a second, that it was worth breaking his own iron discipline to answer it. I stayed longer than I needed to that first morning, watching the crowd disperse from the Court of Remembrance in its slow, orderly way. The veterans helped to waiting cars by grandchildren and neighbors. The guardsmen at last released from their posts and marched back toward the barracks gate in a column as crisp and unremarkable as if nothing at all had happened along their line that day. It struck me, watching them go, how easily the whole affair might have vanished from public notice entirely, how close I had come myself, camera raised for the wrong photograph, to letting the truest moment of that morning pass unrecorded, filed away as nothing more than an old man's private stumble that a passing stranger happened to catch him from. I did not yet know, on that first morning, how the matter would end. I only knew that I had a photograph in my camera bag that told a truer story than any official report was likely to tell, and an old soldier on Coldwater Row who deserved to have his reasons heard before anyone decided what Tobias Wren's half-second of mercy was worth. So I did what I have always done when I do not yet understand a story well enough to write it. I went and asked. What I did not expect, when I began asking those questions, was how close I would come to watching Tobias Wren lose everything for the choice he made. Sergeant Major Blythe was not a cruel man. I want to be fair to him from the start, but he was a man who had built his entire career and his own sense of himself on the conviction that the Guard's discipline was not a decoration on top of its honor, but the very foundation of it, that a guardsman who moved when he was ordered still was a guardsman who could not, in the end, be trusted to hold any line at all. By the following morning, word had reached me through the barracks grapevine, the way such things always do, that Blythe intended to bring the matter before Captain Osric Haldon, commander of the ceremonial ranks, as a formal breach of post, the kind of charge that could see a young guardsman quietly transferred out of the ceremonial guard altogether, his 3 years of service to that post erased from his record as though they had never happened, all for the crime of catching an old man before he hit the stones. Coldwater Row sat at the edge of the old Garrison district, a short street of narrow brick houses that had been built 100 years before to house the widows and retired men of the King's Own Fusiliers, back when the regiment still kept its own quarter of the city. Silas Merritt's house was the fourth from the corner, distinguished from its neighbors by nothing grander than a well-kept row of winter pansies along the front step and a small brass plate beside the door, worn nearly smooth, that read simply MERRITT. I knocked twice before I heard the slow, uneven approach of his cane against the floorboards inside, and when the door opened I found myself looking at a man who, out of his ceremonial dress and without the crowd around him, looked smaller than he had in the court of remembrance, and far more tired. "You're the fellow with the camera," he said, before I had gotten more than my name out. His voice still carried the clipped, level cadence of a much younger man's parade ground training, even now, even worn thin by age. "Voss. I've seen your name under the pictures for years." He did not seem surprised that I had come, and he did not seem particularly eager to send me away, which I took, correctly as it turned out, as an invitation of sorts. He led me back through a narrow hall lined with photographs. A wedding, unmistakably decades old. A woman I would learn was his late wife, Eleanor, gone 9 years now, and hung slightly apart from the rest in a plain dark frame, a formal portrait of a young man in Fusilier uniform, no older than 20, with Silas Merritt's own straight-backed bearing, and a smile that the old man himself had, I suspected, not worn in a very long time. We settled at his kitchen table, and he made tea without asking whether I wanted it, moving around the small kitchen with the careful, economical motions of a man who has long since learned exactly how much his body will forgive him in a day, and has no intention of spending more of that allowance than the task requires. I noticed, though I did not remark on it, that he did not once put weight on his right leg without first bracing a hand against the counter. "You want to know about the fall," he said, setting the cups down and lowering himself into the chair across from me with a small, controlled grunt of effort. "Or you want to know about the boy who caught me? Which is it?" "Both, I expect," I said, "though I think they're the same story." He almost smiled at that. "They are. Though it took me the better part of an hour last night lying awake to work out that they were." He wrapped both hands around his cup, not drinking, and for a while he said nothing at all, and I have learned, in 30 years of asking people to speak about the things that matter most to them, not to fill that kind of silence with a question. Eventually he said, "I was 19 when I went north, to the ridge they called Kestrel. You'll not have heard of it unless your own people were there. It doesn't get remembered the way the big battles do. 3 days of fighting over a stretch of high ground that changed hands twice and then, in the end, hardly mattered at all to how the whole business finished. But it mattered to the men who were on it." He told me the story the way I imagine he had told it perhaps a dozen times in 60 years, worn smooth in places, sharp and specific in others. The cold that had come early that autumn, the mortar round that had caught his section on the second morning, the fragment that had taken 2 men beside him outright and left him with a shattered kneecap and a piece of hot metal, buried behind it that the field surgeons had judged too dangerous to dig out. Not then, not with the lines moving the way they were. It had stayed there ever since. 61 years, he told me, tapping 2 fingers once against his own knee as though greeting an old and unwelcome acquaintance. The surgeons in later years had offered more than once to go back in after it, now that the medicine was better, and every time he had declined. "Why?" I asked, though I thought I could already half-guess the answer. "Because it's mine," he said simply. "It's the only thing I brought back from that ridge that I still have. Everything else I lost up there, one way or another, I lost for good." He was quiet again, and then he added, in a voice gone a shade rougher, And because the cold reminding me it's there is about the only thing left that still makes me feel like the man who was on that ridge, instead of just an old fellow who used to be him. I asked him gently about the metal ribbons I had seen pinned above his heart in the court of remembrance, and he told me, without any particular pride in his voice, that the crown had given him the Cross of Valor the following spring, for what he insisted, waving a hand as if brushing the whole matter aside, was nothing more than staying where he'd been told to stay when it would have been easier to run. I did not press him on the details. Some men wear their decorations as an invitation to the story behind them, and some men wear them as a kind of quiet debt they are still paying off, and I understood within the first 10 minutes of sitting at that table which kind of man Sela's merit was. It was the photograph in the hallway that I finally asked him about, because I had noticed, on the walk back to the kitchen, that his eyes had gone to it for just a moment longer than they had gone to any of the others. The way a man's eyes will always find the one thing in a room that costs him something to look at. "My son," he said, "Aldous. Named for my own father." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, a small, unconscious motion, and I understood I had touched the center of the thing before he had even finished drawing the breath to explain it. He went into the Fusiliers same as I did, same regiment, 31 years ago this spring, though I never once asked him to. Never once. I'd have been glad if he'd wanted nothing to do with any of it, given what it cost me. But he wanted to, and I was proud of him for wanting it. God help me. And I've had a great many years since to wonder whether that pride of mine had anything to do with what happened to him. He did not tell me the whole of it that first afternoon, and I did not ask him to. I learned only what he was willing to give me then. That Aldous Merritt had died in a border skirmish 11 years into his own service, in an action so small and so far from any of the campaigns the histories bother to name that it had earned in the end, nothing grander than a single carved line on the sanctum wall alongside several hundred others, and a folded flag that Sela's Merritt kept, I would later see, in the same drawer as his own Cross of Valor, as though the two decorations belonged together and could not rightly be separated. "That's why I stand," he said, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask him the question I had come to ask. "Every year, however long the silence runs, however my leg feels about it. Because somewhere in that 2 minutes, the herald reads the Fusiliers' names, and my boy's name is one of them, and I will not sit down while a man is reading my son's name aloud to the whole of Eldermoor. I have never once sat down for it. I don't intend to start." I asked him whether he had ever considered that his family, or his neighbors, or the Crown's own physicians, might prefer he honor his son from a chair. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, something older and steadier than either. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I have been offered a chair every single Founder's Day for the last 11 years, by my neighbor, by the ushers. Twice, if you can believe it, by a very well-meaning young officer who clearly thought he was doing me a kindness. I have said no every single time, and I will go on saying no, because sitting is not disrespectful to my son. I know that much in my head. But my heart has never once agreed with my head on the matter, and at 81 years old I have stopped expecting the two of them to reach an understanding." He paused, and something in his face softened, just slightly, toward what had happened the day before. "What I did not expect," he said, "was that a boy in a red coat, 4 feet away, with every reason in the world to look straight ahead and let an old fool go down on his own stubborn pride, would decide instead that I didn't have to choose between standing for my son and staying on my feet at all. He gave me a third way I hadn't thought existed. That's not a small thing to give a man, not at my age. He asked me, before I left that afternoon, whether I knew what had become of the guardsman, whether the Crown would think less of him for what he'd done. I told him honestly that I did not yet know, but that I intended to find out, and that if it came to it, I did not think Sela's Merritt himself would be an unhelpful witness in the boy's defense. "You come back and tell me if that lad's in trouble over me," he said at the door, leaning on his cane with the particular fierceness of a man who has decided, somewhere in the last hour, exactly whose side he is on. I fought a war so boys like that could grow up free to make a decision like the one he made. I'll not sit quiet in my kitchen and let the guard punish him for making it well. I told him I would come back. I did not yet know how many more times I would have reason to. It took me 3 days to arrange a proper conversation with Guardsman Wren, and I want to be honest that it took some persuading, both of him and of the barracks adjutant who controlled access to off-duty guardsmen the way a bank vault controls access to its gold. In the end, it was Wren himself who agreed to it, over the adjutant's clear reluctance, and he agreed on the condition that we meet away from the barracks entirely, at a small tea house near the river that he said his own grandfather used to favor. I did not understand the significance of that detail until we had been talking for the better part of an hour. He arrived out of uniform, in a plain gray coat that made him look younger than he had in his red tunic and bearskin, more like an ordinary young man off duty for the afternoon than the rigid figure I had watched hold an old soldier upright through the long silence. He ordered tea and did not touch it, and for the first 10 minutes of our conversation I got very little from him beyond careful, correct, faintly guarded answers. The sort of answers a young man gives when he has already been warned, in language he understood perfectly well, that whatever he says to a newspaper man might be read back to him in a formal inquiry. It was not until I asked him, almost as an aside, whether he had family in the district, that something in him finally loosened. "My grandfather used to bring me here," he said, looking down at the worn wooden table as though he could still see some earlier version of it, "before he died. He liked this place because it was quiet and because nobody ever asked him about the war." He was silent a moment, turning his untouched cup a quarter turn, an unconscious gesture I recognized with a small jolt, because I had watched Silas Merritt make the very same motion with his own teacup 3 days before. "He served," Wren said. "Same regiment as the old gentleman I helped, as it happens, King's Own Fusiliers. Not the same campaign. My grandfather's war came a good while after Kestrel Ridge, but the same uniform, more or less, the same silence about it afterward. He never once told me what he'd seen. Not once in 19 years I knew him. He'd go quiet on Founder's Day every year, and I learned as a boy not to ask him why, because asking only ever made him look further away, not closer." "And you enlisted anyway," I said. "Partly because of him," Wren admitted. "I wanted to understand what he carried and never spoke of. I don't know that I do understand it, even now, but I think I understand it better than I did before last week." He looked up at me then, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression, as though he suspected I wanted a grander explanation than the one he was about to give me, and felt he owed me the honest, smaller one instead. "When I saw the old gentleman's knee go, I didn't think about my grandfather. I want to be clear about that because it would make a tidier story if I had, and I don't want to hand you a tidier story than the truth. I didn't think about anything. That's the honest answer. I've turned it over every night since, trying to remember what went through my mind in that half-second, and the truth is nothing did. There wasn't a thought. There was just," he made a small, helpless gesture with one hand, as though grasping for something just past his fingers. "A man about to hit the ground, 4 feet from me, and a body that moved before whatever part of me does the deciding had even finished waking up." I asked him whether he had understood, in that moment or in the seconds immediately after, what it might cost him. "Not in the moment," he said. "After, yes." The instant I had him steady and I felt Sergeant Major Blythe's eyes on me from the foot of the steps, I understood exactly what it would cost me. And I want to tell you something, Mr. Voss, and I'd like you to write it down accurately, because I've thought about how to say this and I don't want it to come out sounding braver than it is." He paused, choosing his words with the same careful economy Silas Merritt had used at his kitchen table 3 days before. I was afraid. Standing there holding him up through the rest of that silence, watching Blythe's face out of the corner of my eye. I was afraid the whole time. I've wanted to be a ceremonial guardsman since I was 9 years old, watching the color parade with my grandfather's hand on my shoulder. 3 years I trained for that post. And I stood there afraid I'd just thrown it away over a decision I never remember making. But I want you to understand, I was never afraid I'd made the wrong choice, only that I might have to pay more for the right one than I was prepared to pay. He told me, over the second cup of tea he still did not touch, what the regulations actually said about the long silence, and I set them down here as plainly as he gave them to me, because I think most people outside the Guard, myself included until that afternoon, do not understand quite how absolute the rule truly is. A ceremonial guardsman on post during a royal tribute is required to hold his position without motion, without speech, and without deviation from his fixed orders for the full duration of the observance, regardless of provocation, disturbance, or, and this was the clause Wren recited to me with a kind of grim, private irony, any occurrence not directly threatening the person of the sovereign or a member of the royal household. A collapsing veteran, in the strict language of the regulation, was neither. The rule existed, Wren explained, because the whole meaning of the ceremonial post is built on the guardsman's absolute reliability under any circumstance short of true danger. The same discipline that lets him stand motionless for hours through heat, cold, insult, and provocation is the discipline the crown depends on to know, without doubt, that when he does move, it will mean something. Break that trust in one direction, even for the kindest reason, and you have put a crack in the whole structure that makes the post worth anything at all. I understood the rule before I broke it, Wren said. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I acted out of ignorance. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly what the regulation said, because Sergeant Major Blythe had drilled it into every one of us the week before, as it happens, after a story went round about a guardsman at some other post who'd fainted at his position rather than break it during a storm. Blythe held him up as the standard, stood there in front of the whole detachment, and told us that man's collapse was the proudest thing he'd seen in 30 years of service, because he never once moved from where he was ordered to stand, storm or no storm, and that any of us who thought we knew better than the regulation in the moment it mattered had no business wearing the uniform. He was quiet a moment. So you understand, Mr. Voss, I didn't break that rule without knowing exactly what I was breaking, or without knowing exactly what the man who trained me thinks a guardsman ought to have done instead. I asked him, then, the question I had been circling for the better part of an hour without quite finding the nerve to ask it directly. If he could live the moment again, knowing everything it might cost him, his post, his career in the ceremonial ranks, perhaps his whole future in the Guard, would he do it the same way? He did not answer quickly, and I have come to respect him for that, because I think a quick answer would have been the easy, performed kind, the kind a man gives when he has already decided what he wants a reporter to print. Instead he sat with the question for a long moment, looking out the small window at the gray river beyond it, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone very quiet and very steady. I keep thinking about what my grandfather never told me, he said, about whatever it was that made him go silent every Founder's Day for 19 years. I never got to ask him, because I didn't understand until he was gone how much I wanted to know. I think about that old gentleman on Coldwater Row, and how there's a boy's name on that wall that belongs to him, and how he stands through pain that would put most men half his age on the ground, because sitting down feels, to him, like letting go of his son a second time. And then I think about the regulation, and about discipline, and about everything Blythe taught me, and I believe every word of it, Mr. Voss, I do. I believe in the post. I believe a guardsman who moves for no good reason isn't fit to stand it. He looked back at me. But I have decided that I would rather be a guardsman who was relieved of his post for helping a dying hero's father stay on his feet than a guardsman who kept his post perfectly and let him fall. If those are truly the only two men I'm allowed to be, I already know which one I choose. I chose him again, every night this week, lying awake wondering if I'd chosen wrong. I haven't landed on wrong yet. I did not know, when I left that tea house by the river, whether the guard would agree with him. Within the week, I would learn that Sergeant Major Blythe most certainly did not, and that the matter was about to become considerably more serious than a quiet word at the foot of the sanctum steps. The formal notice came 6 days after the founder's remembrance, and I learned of it only because Silas Merritt himself telephoned the Gazette office to tell me, his voice tight with an anger I had not heard in him at his own kitchen table. Guardsman Tobias Wren had been relieved of ceremonial duty pending a formal inquiry into conduct unbecoming his post, the charge to be heard by Captain Osric Halden, commander of the ceremonial ranks, with Sergeant Major Blythe named as the reporting officer. Wren had been confined to routine barracks duty in the meantime, polishing brasswork and standing ordinary interior watches. I would learn, stripped of the red tunic and bearskin that had been, by his own account to me, the whole of what he'd wanted to be since he was 9 years old. And the inquiry itself was to be held in 11 days' time, in a closed session, with the outcome to be entered permanently into his service, record regardless of which way it fell. They're going to end that boy's career over an old man's bad knee, Silas told me over the telephone, and I could hear, even through the crackle of the line, that his hand was not quite steady on the receiver. I want to testify. I want to stand in front of whoever's judging him and tell them exactly what he did and exactly why, and if they still want to punish him after that, then I'll know something about this kingdom I never wanted to know. I told him I would find out whether that was possible, and in the meantime I went, as I had gone before, to ask questions of the people closest to the matter. This time, Sergeant Major Corwin Blythe himself, who agreed to see me with considerably less warmth than either Silas Merritt or Tobias Wren had shown, and who made it clear within the first 2 minutes of our conversation that he did not consider the newspaper's interest in the affair to be either welcome or, in his own words, any business of a man who has never once had to hold a post while his own legs begged him to move. I want to represent Blythe fairly here, because it would be easy, given how this story ends, to paint him simply as the obstacle the tale needed before its resolution, and I do not believe that would be an honest account of the man. He met me in a bare, cold office near the barracks gate, his uniform immaculate even off the parade ground, and though his manner was hard, it was not, I came to understand over the course of that half hour, cruel. It was the manner of a man entirely convinced that he was the last thing standing between an institution he had given his whole life to, and its own slow erosion. "You want to know why I reported him," Blythe said, before I had finished framing my first question. "I'll tell you plainly, and you can print it or not as you like. I don't doubt for one moment that Guardsman Wren's heart was in the right place. I watched the whole thing from the foot of those steps, and I'll tell you something else you can print. Some part of me, standing there, wanted to do exactly what he did. I am not a man made of stone, Mr. Voss, whatever the uniform might suggest to you. But wanting to do a kind thing and being permitted to do it are two very different matters when you are standing a post. The entire crown depends on being unbreakable." He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time in our conversation something like genuine feeling crossed his face, some old weight he had clearly carried a long while. "I have stood that post myself, young man, more years than Wren has been alive. I have stood it through a summer so hot that 2 guardsmen went down with heat sickness on either side of me, and I did not so much as turn my head to see if they were breathing, because that is what the post demands, and because the day a guardsman decides for himself which rules matter and which don't, in the moment, under his own private judgment, is the day the post stops meaning anything at all to anyone watching it. It cannot be that some guardsmen hold the line and others don't, according to how moved they happen to feel on a given morning. Either the discipline is absolute or it is decoration. I have given my whole career to the belief that it is not decoration." I asked him whether he had considered that Wren's judgment, in this one specific instance, might have been correct, that a genuine emergency, a man's collapse, might fall outside the spirit of a rule built to withstand mere provocation and discomfort. "I have considered it every night since it happened," Blythe said, with a bluntness that surprised me. "I am not going to pretend to you that I have not lain awake turning it over, Mr. Voss, the same as I expect that boy has, but my own doubts are not the standard. The regulation is the standard, and the regulation is plain, and if I let my own soft feelings about one old veteran's dignity decide when the rule applies and when it doesn't, then I am no longer enforcing a discipline, I am enforcing my own mood, and so will every sergeant major who comes after me, each with his own notion of which emergencies deserve an exception. That is how an institution comes apart, not all at once, but one reasonable-sounding exception at a time." He sat back. "I did not report Guardsman Wren because I hate him, or because I doubt his heart, or because I wished the old gentleman had fallen. I reported him because it is my duty to report a broken post regardless of the reason behind it, and because I believe, God help me, that if I fail to do that, I will have failed every guardsman who has ever stood that line through worse than what Wren faced and never once moved. The inquiry will decide what's to be done with him. That is not my judgment to make alone, and I have never claimed that it was. But I could not, in good conscience, pretend I had not seen what I saw. It was, I think, the fairest and most honest defense of an unforgiving rule that I had ever heard given, and I left that cold little office understanding, for the first time, that this was not a simple story of a cruel man punishing a kind one. It was something harder than that, and more true to how institutions actually work. Two men, each entirely sincere, each believing with his whole heart that he was protecting something worth protecting, standing on opposite sides of a line neither of them had drawn. My photograph ran 2 days after that conversation, above the fold on a quiet Tuesday, under a headline the Gazette's editor had chosen rather than me, a guardsman's choice, beside 300 words describing, as plainly and as fairly as I knew how, what I had watched happen in the Court of Remembrance and what I had since learned about the old veteran the guardsman had helped, and the boy's grandfather who had never spoken of his own war. I did not mention the inquiry. I did not yet know how it would resolve, and I did not think it was my place to try the matter in the newspaper before the Crown had tried it properly through its own process. I only told the truth of what had happened, and let the photograph, Sela's Merritt's trembling hand on Tobias Wren's wrist, the old man's eyes still closed, the young guardsman's bearskin catching the flat morning light, do whatever the rest of the work needed doing. I have written a great many stories in 30 years at the Gazette, and I have watched a fair number of them land with some modest ripple of public notice and then sink, as most news does, beneath the next day's edition. I was not prepared for what that photograph did instead. Within a day, the letters desk at the paper had received more correspondence than I had ever known it to receive over a single image. Veterans writing in their own hand to say they had stood their own version of the long silence, and knew exactly what it had cost Sela's Merritt to hold it. Mothers of serving soldiers writing to say the photograph had made them weep at their own kitchen tables. 3 separate members of what I would soon learn was the King's Own Veterans Fellowship, the old regimental association that Sela's himself had belonged to for 6 decades, writing not to the Gazette at all but directly to the palace, asking, in polite but unmistakably pointed language, whether the Crown intended to punish a young man for the offense of catching one of their own before he fell. My editor, a careful, unsentimental man named Percival Odo, who had run the Gazette's newsroom for longer than I had worked in it, called me into his office on the second morning of that letter flood, and set the stack of them on the desk between us, thick enough by then that it had begun to slide sideways under its own weight. "I don't run a story on the strength of public feeling alone, Voss," he told me, in the flat tone he reserved for reminding younger reporters of standards he assumed, not always correctly, that they had already absorbed. "Feeling isn't fact. I want to know whether you believe what you printed was fair to every man in it, Blythe included, or whether you let an old soldier's tears and a handsome photograph run away with your judgment." I told him I believed it was fair, and I told him why, that I had sat across from Blythe in his cold little office and heard him defend the regulation as honestly as any man had ever defended anything to me, and that I did not think a single line I had written made him out to be a villain, because I did not believe he was one. Odo read back through my copy himself slowly, the way he always did when he wanted to be certain rather than merely reassured, and at the end of it he said only, "Good. Then let the letters come. A newspaper's job isn't to decide how a story ends. It's to make sure the people who can decide it are looking at the same true thing we are. I have thought of that instruction more than once since, in stories that mattered a good deal less than this one. I read a good number of those letters myself before they were passed along, at Silas Merritt's own request, to the Fellowship's secretary for safekeeping, and I want to set down the substance of just two of them here, because I think they say something the official record of the inquiry never quite captured. One came from a woman in the eastern provinces who wrote that her own late husband had served 40 years in a regiment much like the Fusiliers, and that he had died, at home, in a chair he had refused for the better part of a decade to be helped out of exactly the same stubborn dignity Silas Merritt had described to me at his kitchen table, and that she had spent every day since wishing someone had been standing close enough and brave enough to help him without being asked. The second came from a serving guardsman posted at a different palace gate entirely, a stranger to Wren as far as either of them ever discovered, who wrote simply that he had stood his own post through a bitter winter once, watching an old woman slip on ice not 10 feet from him, and had held his position exactly as ordered, and had carried the shame of that unbroken discipline, he wrote, every single day since. I did not print either letter in the Gazette. They were not, strictly speaking, news. But I kept copies of both in my own files, because I came to believe, reading them, that Tobias Wren's half-second in the Court of Remembrance had reached a good deal further than the Court of Remembrance itself. Into every quiet regret a kingdom's worth of disciplined men had been carrying alone, waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to prove that the regret need not be permanent. I do not know whether it was those letters, or the photograph itself, or simply the slow churn of a story finding its own audience, but by the end of that week the matter had stopped being a quiet barracks affair known to a handful of officers, and had become, whether anyone in the Guard's chain of command had wanted it to or not, a matter the whole of Harrogate seemed to have an opinion about. I want to be honest that this worried me nearly as much as it heartened me. Public sympathy is a powerful thing, but it is not always a fair one, and I had seen enough institutions dig in against outside pressure, purely as a matter of pride, to know that a flood of letters demanding Wren's exoneration might just as easily harden Sergeant Major Blythe's resolve as soften it. I said as much to Silas Merritt when he telephoned me that Friday, his voice for once almost buoyant. "Let them dig in if they like," he told me. "I'm not asking anyone to forgive that boy because a crowd of strangers wrote letters about him. I'm asking them to look at what he actually did plainly, without the regulation held up in front of their eyes like a pair of blinders, and judge it as what it was." He was quiet a moment, and then, in a rougher voice, he added, "I went down to the barracks gate yesterday. They wouldn't let me in to see him, confined to quarters pending inquiry. They told me, very correct about it, 'Very sorry, sir, rules are rules.' So I left a letter with the gate sergeant, and asked him to see that it reached Guardsman Wren directly, and not some file drawer in an adjutant's office. I don't know if it ever did. It had. I learned that much myself a few days later, when I was permitted a second, briefer visit with Tobias Wren, this time inside the barracks, in a bare interior corridor rather than the tea house by the river, with an adjutant hovering close enough to make clear that our conversation, whatever its length, would not be a private one. Wren looked thinner than he had 2 weeks before, and there was a flatness in his manner that had not been there at the tea house. the particular gray weariness of a man who has spent his days polishing brass and standing routine interior watches, while the thing he had trained 3 years for hung, suspended just out of reach, its fate to be decided by other men in a room he would not be permitted to argue in on equal footing. "I got his letter," he told me, before I had even finished my first question, and for the first time in either of our conversations, something in his voice cracked, just slightly, around the edges. "I've read it more times than I probably should admit to a newspaper man." He did not show it to me, and I did not ask him to, but he told me enough of its contents that I set the substance of it down here as he gave it to me, because I think it belongs in this account nearly as much as anything I witnessed myself. Silas Merritt had written, in a hand Wren described as still steady despite everything else age had taken from him, that whatever the inquiry decided, the old man wanted him to know that he had given him back something Silas had believed, until that morning in the court of remembrance, was simply gone for good: the ability to honor his son on his own 2 feet without either falling or breaking. He had written that he did not know what kind of institution would punish a man for that, and that if it came to it, he intended to stand in front of whoever needed convincing and say so himself, cane and bad knee and all, for as long as they would let him talk. "It's a kind letter," Wren said. "Kinder than I probably deserve, given what it's likely cost him in worry, an old man his age going down to a barracks gate to plead a young guardsman's case. But I'll tell you honestly, Mr. Voss, some nights this week it hasn't been enough to keep the doubt away. I keep thinking about what happens if the inquiry goes against me. Captain Haldon could relieve me of the ceremonial ranks permanently. He could enter a formal reprimand that follows me the rest of my service, wherever I'm posted after this. I've started to wonder some nights whether I ought to simply request a transfer myself, before it comes to that, spare everyone the trouble of a hearing, spare Blythe the discomfort of having to be the one who ends it, and just go quietly to some regular garrison post where nobody will ever ask me again what I was thinking that morning." I asked him whether he had said as much to anyone in his chain of command. "Not yet," he admitted. "I keep stopping myself. Every time I sit down to write the request, I think about the old gentleman's letter, and I think, if I run from this now, what was the point of ever standing still for him in the first place? What was I telling him in that half-second, if I can't stand still now, in this longer one, and let the thing be judged fairly instead of running from the judgment because I'm afraid of what it'll say?" He looked at me, and there was something almost pleading in his expression, though I do not think he would have called it that himself. I don't know if that's courage or just stubbornness dressed up to look like it. I've stopped being sure I can tell the difference anymore. I did not have an answer for him that satisfied either of us, and I left the barracks that afternoon with the uncomfortable sense that I had become, whether I had intended it or not, something more than a reporter in this story, a kind of go-between, carrying weight from one man to another that a newspaper man probably has no business carrying. But I did not know, at that point, that the matter was about to be taken entirely out of both Blythe's hands and mine, by a man neither of us had yet properly reckoned with. Captain Osric Haldon commanded the ceremonial ranks of the guard, and in the 9 days between Wren's confinement and the inquiry itself, I had made 2 unsuccessful attempts to speak with him, both politely but firmly declined by his adjutant on the grounds that a matter under active inquiry was not one the commanding officer could discuss with the press before its resolution. I respected that reasoning even as it frustrated me, and I want to say plainly, since I did eventually come to know something of how Haldon conducted himself in those 9 days, that his silence toward me was not indifference. It was, I came to understand, the silence of a man doing a great deal of careful work that he did not intend to perform in public before it was finished. I learned the shape of that work only afterward, partly from Wren himself and partly, much later, from Haldon directly, once the whole matter had been settled, and there was no longer any reason for either of them to guard their account of it. Haldon had not, as Blythe perhaps expected he might, simply reviewed the regulation, weighed Blythe's report, and scheduled a hearing to apply the letter of the rule. He had instead spent those 9 days doing something closer to what I myself had been doing, going and asking. He interviewed, by Wren's later account, no fewer than 11 witnesses from the Court of Remembrance, including 3 veterans from Silas Merritt's own row who had seen the whole of it, the neighbor who had walked Silas home afterward, 2 of the other ceremonial guardsmen posted nearby. And in a conversation that surprised me more than almost anything else in this story when I finally learned of it, Sergeant Major Blythe himself, at some length. Not as the reporting officer building a case, but as a man Haldon clearly respected and wanted to understand fully before he made any judgment of his own. He went, too, to Coldwater Row, though Silas did not mention this to me himself until weeks later, in the particular offhand way old soldiers have of mentioning the things that matter to them most. Haldon had come alone, out of uniform, and sat at the same kitchen table where I had sat, and asked Silas Merritt, by his own account, only one real question beyond the plain facts of that morning: whether he believed, looking back on it now, that Guardsman Wren's decision had been the act of a man who could not be trusted to hold discipline, or the act of a man who understood something about discipline that the regulation itself had not quite anticipated. I told him, Silas said to me, recounting it long afterward with something like satisfaction, that in 60 years of wearing a uniform myself, on and off, I had come to believe the second kind of man was a good deal rarer and a good deal more valuable than the first, and that if his guard could not find a way to keep men like that in its ranks, it was going to end up with nothing standing its posts but statues, and I did not think that was what the king's own guard was meant to be. Whatever else passed between them at that kitchen table, I do not know, because neither man ever told me the whole of it, and I have come to think some conversations are meant to stay exactly as private as the 2 people who had them intended. What I do know is that, by the 9th day, Captain Haldon had reached a decision that surprised nearly everyone involved, myself included, and it was not the decision either Blythe or Wren had been bracing themselves for. He did not convene a closed disciplinary hearing at all. Instead, on the morning the inquiry had been scheduled to open behind closed doors in a bare regimental office, Captain Haldon sent word, first to Blythe, then to Wren, and finally, in a formal letter I would not see the contents of for some time, to the office of the king's own household, that he intended to present the matter not as a disciplinary proceeding to be settled quietly within the ceremonial ranks, but as a question of guard policy worth bringing directly before the Crown. A guardsman's fitness for his post, Haldon had apparently written, was not truly the question at issue at all. The real question, the one the regulation itself had never been written broadly enough to answer, was what the guard's discipline was actually for, whether it existed to produce men who could not be moved under any circumstance whatsoever, or men who could be trusted, under every circumstance short of true danger, to hold their post exactly as ordered, and who could then be trusted, in the rare moment such an order plainly failed to serve the purpose it existed to serve, to exercise a judgment worthy of the uniform they wore. That was not a question, Haldon had written, that a captain of the ceremonial ranks was equipped to settle alone, in a closed room, on the strength of one sergeant major's report and one guardsman's defense. It was a question, he believed, that deserved to be settled in the open, by the one authority in the kingdom whose judgment on matters of honor and duty no one in the guard, least of all Sergeant Major Blythe, would think to question. He was asking, in other words, to bring the whole matter before King Alaric himself. I did not expect the Crown to grant such a request. In 11 years of covering the palace at Harrogate for the Gazette, I had never once known the king to intervene personally in a matter of internal guard discipline, however much public letter writing might surround it, and I said as much to Silas Merritt when he telephoned to ask whether I thought it likely to happen at all. I was wrong, and I have since come to believe I was wrong for a reason that says something true about the king himself, though I did not fully understand it until I stood in the long gallery at the palace at Harrogate 2 weeks later and watched him settle the matter with my own eyes. The audience was granted for a morning in early autumn, in the long gallery rather than any closed regimental chamber. A deliberate choice, I would learn, on Haldon's part and ultimately on the king's own, since a matter that had already become a public question of what the guard's honor required was not, in the king's stated view, a matter that ought to be settled behind a closed door. I was permitted to attend as the Gazette's correspondent, along with 2 other members of the press, and I understood, watching the gallery fill that morning, that word of the audience had traveled a good deal further than the newspapers alone could account for. There were perhaps 40 guardsmen present, off-duty and out of uniform but unmistakable in their bearing, standing at the back of the hall in loose ranks that had arranged themselves, without any order I could see given, into something very close to formation. There was a small cluster of gray-haired men in old regimental blazers whom I recognized. Once Silas arrived among them leaning on the arm of his neighbor, as members of the King's own Veterans Fellowship. And there, seated near the front on a hard wooden bench with his cane held upright between his knees like a soldier's rifle at rest, was Silas Merritt himself, dressed in the same metal ribbons he had worn in the Court of Remembrance, his back as straight as I had ever seen it. Tobias Wren stood near the center of the floor when the king entered, in full dress uniform for the first time since his confinement. I later learned Haldon himself had insisted on it, over the objection of an adjutant who felt a guardsman under inquiry had no business wearing the uniform he stood accused of dishonoring, a point Haldon had apparently settled with a single sentence I heard repeated afterward by more than one guardsman with evident satisfaction. He is not accused of dishonoring it. He is accused of understanding it too well for one clause of the regulation to hold him. Wren stood at attention, rifle, straight even without a rifle, his face schooled into the same flat calm I had watched him hold through the long silence itself, though I thought I could see, standing close enough that morning, the faint tremor of a man who did not yet know which way his life was about to turn. King Alaric entered without fanfare, as he generally did for matters he considered serious rather than ceremonial, and took his place not on any raised dais but in a plain chair set at the same level as the rest of the hall, a detail I noted at the time and have thought about often since. He was, by that point in his reign, a man well past the vigor of his youth, silver through the temples, but I had covered enough of his public appearances to know that whatever age had taken from him physically, it had not touched the particular stillness he brought to any room he judged to matter. He listened first, at some length, to Captain Haldon's formal account of the events in the Court of Remembrance, plain, unembellished, giving neither Wren nor Blythe the better of the telling, and then to Sergeant Major Blythe, who rose and gave, in front of the king and the assembled guard and the veterans and the press, very nearly the same defense of the regulation he had given me weeks before in his cold little office. I want to record here that Blythe did not soften his position for the occasion, and I respected him for it. He stood at rigid attention before his king, and said, in a voice that did not waver, that he had reported Guardsman Wren's conduct, because it was his sworn duty to report a broken post regardless of the reasons behind it, that he believed absolutely in the discipline the ceremonial ranks depended on, and that he would make the same report again tomorrow under the same circumstances, whatever the crowd in that gallery might think of him for it. I do not stand here asking your majesty to punish this young man out of any wish to see him suffer, he said. I stand here because 30 years of my own service have taught me that an institution's honor is built one unbroken post at a time, and I could not, in good conscience, pretend I had not seen a post broken. If your majesty judges that this particular breaking was a lawful exception, I will accept that judgment and serve under it as faithfully as I have served under every judgment before it. But I would be lying to the crown I have sworn to serve if I stood here and told you I had no doubts left in me at all. It was, I thought, watching him, the statement of a man who had already half guessed which way the morning was going to go, and who had decided that his own honor required him to make his case fully anyway, rather than let it go by default. Silas Merritt spoke next, and I do not think I need to record every word of what he said, because I have already given the substance of it in this account. His son's name on the sanctum wall, the 61 years he had carried a piece of kestrel ridge behind his kneecap, the third way a young guardsman had given him that he had not believed still existed. But I will set down the last part of what he said, because I wrote it in my notebook as close to word for word as I could manage, and because I believe it was the moment that turned the room, if the room needed turning at all by that point. "I'm not here to tell the Crown that discipline doesn't matter," he said, leaning both hands on the head of his cane, his voice carrying further than I would have thought an 81-year-old man's voice could carry in that high gallery. "I gave the better part of my youth to discipline, and I buried a son who gave the whole of his to it, and I would never stand in front of my king and say the rule that boy broke was worthless. I am here to say that I watched, with my own eyes, a young man hold that rule in one hand and an old soldier's dignity in the other, and find a way to honor both at once, when the regulation itself had never imagined a man might need to. He did not abandon his post, Your Majesty. He became, for 2 minutes, the truest thing his post was ever meant to stand for, the king's own care, reaching a subject who could not reach it for himself. If that is a crime, then I do not understand what the uniform is for any more, and I have worn some version of it myself or my son's memory for 60 years. When it came Wren's turn to speak, Captain Haldon asked him only one question, in front of the whole hall, whether he stood by the choice he had made, understanding fully now what it had already cost him and might yet cost him further. "I do, Captain," Wren said, and his voice, though quiet, did not shake. "I was trained to hold my post through provocation, through discomfort, through insult, and I believe in every part of that training. But I was never trained to stand still and watch a man who earned his cross of valor defending this kingdom go down onto the stones in front of it, and I don't believe, Your Majesty, that I ever should have been. If I've dishonored my post, I'm prepared to accept whatever judgment follows from it. But I don't believe I have. I believe I finally understood, in that half-second, what the post was actually for." King Alaric did not answer immediately. He sat a long moment in that plain chair, his hands folded, looking not at Wren or at Blythe, but, I noticed, at Silas Merritt, with an expression I have tried many times since to describe accurately, and have never quite managed better than this. The look of a man measuring the true weight of something against everything else he has ever been taught to value, and finding, at the end of the measuring, that the scale had not even come close to balancing the way the regulation assumed it would. When he finally spoke, he rose from his chair to do it, and the whole gallery came to its feet with him in a single rustling motion, guardsmen and veterans and press alike. "I have listened this morning," the king said, "to a sergeant major defend a discipline I depend on absolutely, and I want it entered into the record of this audience that Sergeant Major Blythe's report was not merely correct but necessary. An institution that quietly overlooks its own broken rules, however kind the reason, is an institution already halfway to losing them altogether. He did his duty in bringing this matter forward, and I will not have any man in this hall walk away from today believing otherwise." He paused and let that settle, and I saw Blythe's shoulders, which had been rigid through the whole of the audience, ease by some small but visible degree. "But I have also listened," the king went on, "to an old soldier tell me what it cost him to stand through 2 minutes of silence for a son this kingdom asked of him and never gave back, and I have watched a young guardsman stand in front of his king and refuse to pretend he regrets the choice that saved that old soldier from the stones. And I find that I cannot, in honesty, call that choice a failure of discipline. I believe it was the rarest kind of discipline there is, the discipline to know, In a half-second, no regulation could have anticipated that the letter of an order and the purpose behind it had come apart, and to choose the purpose. That is not a lesser discipline than the one that holds a man still through a storm. I believe, on reflection, that it may be the greater one, because it asks a man to risk everything the first discipline has earned him, on his own judgment, in a moment with no time to ask permission. He turned then and looked directly at Wren, and I have never in 11 years of covering that man seen him address anyone, soldier or subject, with quite the gravity he brought to what he said next. "Guardsman Wren, I am not going to enter a reprimand against your record today. I am going to enter a commendation instead, and I am going to ask Captain Haldon to see that the regulation itself is amended, so that no guardsman who comes after you need lie awake, as I understand you have, wondering whether mercy and duty are truly opposed to one another on the day it matters. They are not. You proved that in the court of remembrance, and you have proved it again this morning, standing here and refusing to disown the choice even when you believed it might ruin you. That is worth more to this kingdom than a perfectly unbroken post ever could be." There was a silence in the long gallery after the king finished speaking, though it bore no resemblance to the long silence of the court of remembrance. This was a silence of held breath about to break, and it broke a moment later into something I had never once heard inside a royal audience in 11 years of attending them. Applause, ragged at first and then general, guardsmen and veterans and press alike, until Captain Haldon had to raise a hand for quiet so that the king could finish what he had begun. He was not finished. He turned next to Sergeant Major Blythe, and I watched the older man brace himself, plainly expecting some further word about the regulation he had spent 30 years enforcing, perhaps even a rebuke dressed up as a compliment. What he received instead was something else entirely. "Sergeant Major," the king said, "I would ask you to remain in your post, and I would ask you to remain the man who enforces this discipline with exactly the seriousness you have shown it today. Because Guardsman Wren's judgment means nothing at all if there is no Sergeant Major Blythe standing ready to question it, to test it, to make certain it was truly judgment, and not simply a young man's excuse for laziness or fear dressed up afterward as compassion. I do not want a guard full of men who believe they may break their post whenever their own hearts move them. I want a guard that holds its discipline absolute, precisely so that when a man like Guardsman Wren breaks it, everyone watching, you most of all, can trust that it was truly worth breaking for. You were not his obstacle this morning, Sergeant Major. You were his proof." I watched something shift in Corwin Blythe's face at that. Not relief exactly, because I do not think the man had ever doubted his own righteousness enough to need relieving of it, but something closer to recognition, the particular satisfaction of a man who has just heard his life's work described back to him more clearly than he had ever managed to describe it himself. He bowed formally and said nothing further, but I saw him, not 10 minutes later, cross the length of that gallery floor to where Wren stood, and I saw the two men clasp hands in a way that was neither an apology nor quite a congratulation, but something with elements of both. The particular handshake of two soldiers who have argued hard over something that mattered and come out the other side, still able to respect one another for the arguing. Captain Haldon announced, before the audience formally closed, that the regulation governing the long silence and every comparable ceremonial observance would be amended within the month, adding what would come to be known informally throughout the Guard, I am told, as the merit clause, a formal exception permitting a guardsman on post to render immediate assistance to any person in evident physical distress during a royal tribute, provided the assistance was rendered without unnecessary disturbance to the observance, and the guardsman returned to his post, or was properly relieved, the moment the need for assistance had passed. It was, Haldon noted dryly, very nearly a description of exactly what Wren had already done, written into the regulation after the fact rather than before it, which he said he considered not an embarrassment to the Guard but a mark in its favor. That an institution capable of learning from one guardsman's judgment, rather than simply punishing it, was a stronger institution than one that never had to learn anything at all. I found Sila's Merit afterward near the edge of the emptying gallery, still gripping his cane with both hands, and when I asked him how he felt, he did not answer me directly for a long moment, watching instead across the room where Tobias Wren stood surrounded by a knot of fellow guardsmen, all of them clapping him on the shoulder in the rough, wordless way soldiers have of saying the things they cannot quite say plainly. "I feel," Silas said finally, "the way I imagined my boy would have wanted me to feel, watching that. I came here half-braced to fight the whole crown for that lad's honor, cane and all, the way I told you I would. I did not expect to watch the crown decide to fight for it itself, before I ever had to raise my voice." He was quiet a moment longer, and then, in a rougher tone, he added something I did not include in my published account at the time, because it felt too private to print, though I believe I may set it down here now at the far end of this whole story, where perhaps it belongs. "I have spent 11 years standing through that silence, half convinced I was the only one left in this kingdom who still remembered what it cost. I do not feel that way anymore. That is worth more to me than any medal they might have pinned on that boy's chest today. I have Aldous' name on that wall and a king who just stood up in front of the whole guard and told them that remembering him properly is worth more than a perfect line of unmoving statues. I did not know, walking in here this morning, that I still had it in me to feel that grateful about anything. I want to close this account honestly, and honesty requires me to say that I did not entirely trust my own composure, standing there listening to him, remembering my own father's silence every Founder's Day of his life, a silence I had never once managed to break through the way Sila's merits had finally been broken through, by a stranger's arm and a king's plain words in a gallery full of witnesses. I do not think I am alone in that. I have covered a great many ceremonies in 30 years at the Gazette, and I have rarely seen a room of grown men, soldiers, veterans, hardened newspapermen among them, so unashamed of the tears in evidence around that gallery that morning. It was not a sorrowful weeping. It was the particular kind that comes when something long clenched is finally, carefully, permitted to let go. The months that followed did not make for the kind of dramatic newspaper copy that had carried the story that far, and I want to say plainly that I consider that one of the better outcomes a story like this can have. Guardsman Wren returned to the ceremonial ranks within the week, his citation entered into his record in place of the reprimand that had once seemed all but certain, and by the following spring, I am told, he had been recommended for the rank of Lance Corporal. Not, Captain Halden was careful to tell anyone who asked, because of the Court of Remembrance affair specifically, but because the whole business had put a young guardsman in front of enough senior officers, under enough scrutiny, that his ordinary competence had finally been noticed alongside the extraordinary decision that made him briefly famous. Sergeant Major Blythe, I am glad to report, remained exactly as immovable a fixture of the ceremonial ranks as he had ever been, and I am told by more than one guardsman that he took a particular gruff satisfaction, in the months afterward, in personally briefing every new recruit on the merit clause himself, always adding, in a tone his men had apparently learned to recognize as high praise from him, that the regulation existed, because one young fool had been stubborn enough to force the whole guard to think harder than it had in a generation. I attended the small ceremony at which Wren's promotion was formally announced, a modest affair on the barracks parade ground rather than anything so grand as the long gallery audience, and I noted, watching from the edge of the assembled ranks, that it was Blythe himself who read out the citation, his voice as flat and correct as it had ever been, betraying nothing beyond the plain words of the order until the very last line, when he set the paper down, looked directly at the newly minted Lance Corporal standing at attention before him, and said, entirely off the script Captain Halden had prepared for him, "Carry it the way you carried that old man. That's the only instruction I've got left to give you." It was, from a man of Blythe's temperament, very nearly an embrace, and I saw Wren's composure waver for just a moment before he caught it, the same way I had watched him catch Sela's merits failing weight nearly a year before, quickly, quietly, and without any fuss at all. What I did not expect, and what I think matters more to this account than any of the official consequences, was what grew up quietly between Tobias Wren and Sela's merit in the year that followed. I learned of it only in pieces, because neither man was inclined to make a public matter of it, and I respected that inclination enough not to press for more than they were willing to give me. I know that Wren began, sometime that winter, to call at the house on Coldwater Row on his free afternoons. At first, by his own account, simply to see that the old man was managing well enough through the cold months, and then, as the visits became a settled habit rather than an occasional kindness, for reasons that had less to do with checking on an old man's welfare, and more to do with the plain fact that he had come to enjoy the old man's company. Sela's taught him over that year a good deal about the regiment they had both, in their different ways and different generations, given a portion of themselves to, not the official history printed in the regimental records, but the smaller, truer history of what it had actually felt like to be a young man on a cold ridge, or a young man standing 4 hours in the rain outside a palace gate, learning, each in his own time, what the uniform asked of him beyond the parade ground version of it. I know, too, because Sela's told me himself over another cup of tea at his kitchen table the following autumn, that he had made contact, through the King's own Veterans Fellowship, with 2 surviving men who had served alongside Tobias Wren's grandfather, and that he had passed along to Wren, piece by careful piece, some of what those men remembered, not the details of whatever had made the old man go silent every Founder's Day for 19 years, because those 2 surviving comrades, out of the same old soldier's instinct that had kept Wren's grandfather silent himself, chose not to share the darker particulars, but enough of the ordinary, human shape of the man to give his grandson something more than a photograph and an unbroken silence to remember him by. I could not give the boy back his grandfather, Sela's told me that afternoon, turning his teacup its familiar quarter turn on the table, but I could give him back a little of the truth that his grandfather's silence took from him without meaning to. I understand what that silence costs a family, Mr. Voss, better than most men living. I did not intend to let another young man grow old wondering, the way I let my own boy grow up half a stranger to what I'd carried, before I finally learned better, too late for it to do either of us any good. I want to describe, before I bring this account to its close, the Founder's remembrance that followed the first one held under the amended regulation, and the first one I attended, I confess, less as a professional obligation and more as a man who had come to care a great deal about how the morning would unfold. The Court of Remembrance looked, on the surface, exactly as it always had. The same gray autumn light, the same banners moving in the same low wind, the same rows of veterans assembling with the same careful, deliberate dignity, the same 6 ceremonial guardsmen taking their posts along the processional route in the same immaculate red and black. But I noticed, watching Tobias Wren take his position that morning, that his post had shifted, by perhaps 6 feet, from where it had stood the year before, close enough now to the 3rd row of benches that I understood, without needing to be told, that this had not happened by accident. I learned afterward from Captain Haldon that it had not. Wren had requested the post himself, and Haldon, in a small and entirely unofficial accommodation that I suspect will never appear in any regulation, however generously the merit clause might be interpreted, had granted it. I noticed, too, a low wooden bench that had not been there the year before, set discreetly at the end of the 3rd row, close enough for any veteran whose legs failed him to reach it in 2 steps rather than none at all, Haldon's doing again. I was told, quietly instituted at every ceremonial observance across the kingdom that autumn, without fanfare, without a single word of official announcement. Simply because a captain of the ceremonial ranks had decided that a kingdom capable of amending a regulation for one old soldier's dignity was capable of building a bench for the rest of them as well. Sila's merit took his place in the third row exactly where he always had, cane in hand, refusing, as he had told me he would, any offer of the bench itself. But when the herald called the fusiliers' names and the whole assembly rose for the long silence, I watched Tobias Wren's eyes move once briefly, to check the old man's stance before fixing forward again into the same flawless, disciplined calm he had held the year before, not the furtive, guilty glance of a man breaking a rule he knew he shouldn't, but the open, permitted vigilance of a man doing exactly what his post now existed to let him do. Silas stood the full 2 minutes on his own 2 feet, without needing to be caught, without his knee betraying him even once, and I have wondered since whether that was simple good fortune or whether some part of an 82-year-old man stubborn will have drawn a little extra strength from knowing, this time, that if his leg did fail him, there would be no shame in it, no rule broken, no young man's career risked, only a hand close enough to reach him, exactly as it should always have been. When the trumpet finally sounded and the long silence released its hold on the whole assembled kingdom, I watched Tobias Wren step, openly this time, the 6 feet to where Sila's merit stood, and offer his arm for the walk back to the bench, and I watched the old man take it without hesitation, the way a man takes the arm of someone he has come, over the better part of a year, to trust the way he might trust a grandson. Neither of them looked toward the crowd. I do not think either of them remembered in that moment that anyone was watching at all, which I have come to believe is the truest measure of how far the kindness between them had traveled from the single dramatic half-second that had first brought them together. It was no longer a moment performed for anyone's benefit, mine included. It was simply 2 men, one old and one young, who had found in each other something that the regulation, for all its careful language about posts and discipline and duty, had never quite had the words to describe. I went to Coldwater Row myself, one last time, a few weeks after that second founder's remembrance, meaning only to close out my notes on a story I had by then been following in one form or another for the better part of a year. I found Tobias Wren already there when I arrived, out of uniform, sitting across the kitchen table from Sila's in the same chair I had once occupied myself, and I understood, from the easy quiet between them, that I had walked into the middle of something that had become an ordinary Sunday afternoon, rather than an occasion either of them thought to make a fuss over. Sila's rose when I came in, more slowly than he once had, I noticed, though steadily enough, and without reaching for the counter first the way he had that first afternoon we'd met, and went to the drawer where I knew he kept his son's folded flag and his own cross of valor. He came back to the table with something smaller cupped in his palm, and set it down in front of Tobias Wren, with the particular deliberate care of a man handing over something he has thought about for a long while before deciding he was ready to part with it. It was a cap badge, small and tarnished with age, the crossed rifles and laurel of the king's own fusiliers worn nearly smooth at the edges. This was Aldous', Silas said, from his training days before they issued him the proper one. He kept it in his kit his whole service for luck, he told me once, though I don't believe he was a superstitious boy at heart. I've kept it in that drawer 9 years now, since his mother passed, and it came to me along with everything else of hers that had somehow ended up keeping company with everything of his. He nodded once at Wren, a small, formal gesture that seemed to cost him something and to give him something in the same motion. I'd like you to have it, not because you remind me of him. You don't, particularly, and I don't think either of us would be well served by my pretending you did. I'd like you to have it because you're the reason I still have anything left of him worth honoring properly, on my own 2 feet, instead of sitting in a chair wishing I still could. Seems to me that's worth more than a drawer. I watched Tobias Wren's composure, the same composure I had watched him hold through an entire long silence, through a formal inquiry, through a king's audience in a crowded gallery, come very close to leaving him altogether. He did not say very much in response, which I have come to think was exactly right for the moment. Some gifts are answered better by the way a man's hands close carefully around them than by anything he might find to say. He thanked the old man, quietly, and turned the small badge once between his fingers before slipping it into his breast pocket, and I saw him rest his hand flat against that pocket for a moment afterward, the way a man checks that something important is still where he left it. I did not print any of that in the Gazette. Some moments, I have come to believe over 30 years of chasing other people's stories for a living, belong to the people who lived them and not to the readers who might be moved by them, however true and however good the moving might be. I set it down here only because this account would be incomplete without it, and because I think it explains, better than the king's audience or the amended regulation or any of the official consequences that followed that morning in the Court of Remembrance, what the whole affair had actually been about from the very first half-second Tobias Wren stepped off his post. It was never really about a regulation, or a rank, or even, in the end, about the dignity of a single ceremony. It was about two men who might otherwise never have known each other at all, discovering, because one of them had refused to let the other fall, that they had a great deal to give one another that had nothing to do with duty at all, and everything to do with it. I think often, still, about my own father, and about the many founders' days I watched him stand a little apart from the rest of the family gathering, saying nothing, asking nothing, offering nothing of what he had carried home from his own quieter war. I have come, in the writing of this account, to think of his silence and Tobias Wren's grandfather's as a single silence wearing two different faces. I never once, in all the years I had him, found a way to reach whatever it was he kept behind that silence, and I have made something of a private peace, in the years since he died, with the understanding that some men simply do not have it in them to be reached, however much their sons might wish otherwise, however many gentle questions are asked at however many kitchen tables. But I do not think that is the whole of what I learned, following this story from that gray morning in the Court of Remembrance to the quiet kitchen table on Coldwater Row, where I watched an old man hand a tarnished cap badge across to a young guardsman who had once broken every rule he'd ever been taught in order to catch him. I think what I learned in the end is that the silence itself is not always the true obstacle. My father's silence was his own to keep, and I have made my peace with that. But Silas Merritt's silence, the silence he carried through 11 straight founders' days standing rigid on a ruined knee, might have gone on the same way indefinitely, might have gone to the grave with him, the way I suspect a great deal of my own father's silence did, if a young guardsman with no obligation whatsoever to notice an old man's failing leg had not decided, in half a second he still cannot fully account for, that a rule built to hold a man still through a storm was never meant to hold him still through this. I do not know how many other silences like that are standing, right now, in rows of veterans at ceremonies across this kingdom and every kingdom like it, waiting for someone close enough and brave enough to notice them failing and to close the distance before they fall. I do not know how many young men in red coats and black bearskins are standing 4 feet away from exactly that kind of silence at this very moment, watching a knee begin to dip, weighing a regulation against a stranger's dignity in some half-second no training can fully prepare a man for. I only know that I watched one such half-second happen, from behind a camera I very nearly used for the wrong purpose, and that I have spent the better part of a year since trying to understand it well enough to set it down honestly, and that I believe, having finished the trying, that I understand at least this much of it clearly. Guardsman Tobias Wren was not punished for what he did that morning, though for a good many weeks it seemed a near thing, and I do not believe the outcome would have been half so certain if Captain Halden had been a lesser man, or if Sergeant Major Blythe had been a smaller one, or if an 82-year-old veteran had not been stubborn enough to walk to a barracks gate on a bad knee and leave a letter for a young man he had known for less than a minute. He was commended for it instead, publicly, by a king who understood, watching that gallery full of soldiers and old men and newspapermen, that the truest discipline a guardsman can carry is not the discipline that never bends, but the discipline that knows, in the one moment it truly matters, exactly when bending is the whole of what duty was ever asking of him. I still cover the founder's remembrance every autumn for the Gazette, and I still take my place near the third row of benches with my camera low against my chest, waiting for the wreath laying, the way I have for going on 12 years now. But I no longer chase only the king's portrait against the sanctum wall. I watch the rows of old soldiers rise for the long silence, and I watch the young guardsmen along the processional route hold their posts with the same flawless, unmoving discipline they have always held. And I watch, too, for the particular kind of stillness that is not really stillness at all, but readiness. A guardsman's eyes flicking sideways, just once, toward a row of men who fought so he would never have to, in case one of them should need, this year or some year still to come. A hand close enough to reach him before he falls. I have learned to believe that this readiness, quiet and mostly invisible and asked of no man by any regulation, is the truest honor the court of remembrance has ever paid to the fallen, and to the old men who carry the fallen's memory home with them every single year on legs that do not always agree to carry it. Sila's merit still stands through every silence, cane in hand, refusing every bench, exactly as stubborn as he was the first day I met him. But he does not stand alone anymore, not really, not in any way that matters, and neither, I think, does the young man beside him, who found out, in half a second he still cannot fully explain, exactly what kind of guardsman he was always meant to be.